Good evening. Open your Bibles, if you would, to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy. We're going to be closing out the letter of 2 Timothy. We've been on it for a little while, but these are the last words written down by the Apostle Paul. A great persons like Paul's last words are significant, I would think. When you know you're at the end, and your mind is going to be centered in on some of the more important things that you've always considered in your life. So it's kind of a window that helps us look into their heart or help us to measure how they evaluate their life. And Paul's conclusion to this letter is like a miscellaneous of segment recorded as he's wrapping up his thoughts here to Timothy. If he was dictating these things to Luke, we mentioned this last time. If not then perhaps surely now he picked up the pen himself and wrote out these last words like he did in so many of his other letters. And as we examine these closing comments, notice how it's so personal. And look here, we're going to begin with verses 16 through 18 of chapter 4, 2 Timothy. Paul writes, "At my first defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen." Last week when we were wrapping up that last segment, we read about Alexander, the coppersmith, who had done Paul much harm. And I wonder that the mentioning of him, or bringing that to the forefront of his mind, brought to mind also a time when others had abandoned Paul at significant periods in his life. So he talks about, "At my first defense, nobody supported me, but all deserted me." That word defense, apologia, is where we get the word apology or apologetics. And it's significant, or it signifies really a verbal defense. Someone has been laying an accusation against Paul, and now he's putting up a defense. And we see examples of Paul's verbal defenses all throughout the book of Acts, and Acts 22 and 26. And he invariably uses his defense always, really, I think, as an opportunity to preach the good news, to preach the gospel. And that's pretty amazing. When you're up there and you're being accused of all these things, and he sees that, he's, well, here I want to deal with that by preaching Jesus to you again and again. And a lot of scholars and commentaries have guessed at, which defense is he talking about? What is he talking about when he says my first defense that he speaks of here? So some think it was in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 23. Some think it was when he was up in Caesarea and he was defending himself there before King Agrippa. Was that 24 or 25 there in the book of Acts? Another possibility is that this is an allusion to a defense in the imperial court for Paul. And he's thinking ahead on those things. I think it's more likely that Paul had in mind a more recent defense. Sometimes when we read through here, we see it a little bit in the book of Acts, but when we read through this, we think that he's just waiting for his court date. He goes to his court date, he's found guilty, and then that's it. But their tribunals was a lot more like our judicial system, where you had what they called the prima acto of Roman justice. That would be a preliminary hearing for Paul, after which he would be taken to a second hearing. And that's more of a trial before a Roman tribunal at that point. And then there could be a third one. You can even, as we already know, have appeals, which we saw in Acts chapter 28. And so I think that he's looking at his first defense in this segment of defenses he's having to bring here in Rome. And that's what I think's going on. And so wherever it was, that he was making this first defense, apparently no one supported him. Everybody had deserted him. It means that word for support, it's that same word where we sometimes see about the word escape, to come alongside and assist you, and so to help out. It's kind of like when a witness comes up to in your defense at a hearing, and so that's what's going on here. It's about someone coming up on his behalf. Roman law allowed people of note or importance to stand with the accused. But it's important to realize those of importance or those of note. Not just anybody can come up and stand by Paul, but those that could have done it did not. And so he had to stand there alone. And rather, he says, everyone deserted him. That's the same word he used about Demas's actions in verse 10. And it also makes me think about when all the disciples scattered from Jesus and they abandoned Jesus. They deserted him in the garden when that mob came to arrest him. But like Jesus held no bitterness against the disciples, Paul holds no bitterness against those who did not come and stand with him. As he says there, or concludes in that verse, may it not be counted against them. And some may wonder at that response, that those who would desert him, why would he not count that against them, but he counts it against Alexander the coppersmith up in verse 10. The difference is, Alexander meant it for harm against Paul. Well, these who are abandoned or deserted Paul in this case probably did so out of fear. If you got to remember what's going on here, Paul is more likely being lumped in as maybe one of the leaders of those that Nero said was put fire to Rome, and they have him arrested, and everyone's probably excited to hear about this. And so everyone knows he's going to be found guilty. He's going to die. Paul knows that. And anyone who stands in his defense more than likely would also be arrested and tried as well as being an accomplice to this man. So they're scared. They're fearful of what might happen. And again, because of Paul's sympathy for them, I think about Jesus up on the cross when he makes that statement, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so Paul is most certainly holding on to an attitude of Jesus. And we're going to see that as he quotes also from the 22nd Psalm. And when we come to the end, I want to put up on the screen, I want to show you a parallel of the words that Paul is saying here and the words that are in Psalm 22. If you don't remember, that's the psalm that Jesus quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we'll see that maybe Paul, as he's nearing the end of his life, he's looking at how Jesus approached the end of his life and is doing his best to emulate him in everything he does. So he has, I think, this passage in Psalm 22 in his mind as he's penning these words to Timothy. It's really rather fascinating to me. And when we get down here to verse 17, you get this idea he's lonely, or there's this loneliness that permeates his comments at least, but it's apparent that his purpose is he's not trying to induce sympathy, I think, but I think what he's trying to do is strengthen young Timothy. He wants Timothy to be aware that these things that are happening to Paul, yes, though these things can happen to you, Timothy, but more importantly, he wants Timothy to see and to know that God will help him through whatever situation he might find himself in. Because he adds, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. So here he is at his first defense, all alone. Nobody is there to help him, but he knew God was there, and God was strengthening him, and he was not alone. Stood with him. The Lord stood by him. And we know on other occasions where the Lord did this. In Acts 23, Philippians 4:13. And now, even at the very end, God is not going to abandon his apostle, Paul, at this time. And the reason the Lord stood with Paul writes, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear. So the trial, again, of a leader of this group accused of torching Rome would have generated, I think, a lot of attention. Surely this place, those who didn't have anything to do would pack this courtroom. They want to hear about the things that Paul is going to say and hear his defense. And after calling Paul to be his apostle, Jesus had said, he told him over in Acts 9, that Paul was a chosen instrument of his, and that he would bear his name before the Gentiles and before kings. And this is happening here, right now. So this is really the climax, you could say, the completion of the mission that God had given to Paul, and is coming to completion. This is it. You can't get to any greater earthly king than the emperor and all these notable Gentiles in the city. So here he is. Because the Lord had stood with him at the completion of this first defense, Paul says he was rescued out of the lion's mouth. This is not literally out of the lion's mouth, as some commentators actually said. Paul was a Roman citizen. He is exempt from being fed to lions. You can't do that under Roman law to Roman citizens. So it's not likely he's talking literally here. It's also doubtful that the lion is referring to Nero himself, as others think. And I don't think it's talking about the roaring lion of Satan from 1 Peter 5:8 either. I think it's just a proverbial saying. Like we would say, I've been rescued from the jaws of death. He's been rescued from the lion's mouth. And there are several parallels. And this is, I want to point to this one. I don't want to get too much into it. We're going to hit it at the end. But the verse here in 2 Timothy and Psalm 22, you see a parallel, especially here, because the psalmist says, "Save me from the lion's mouth." While Paul says, "I was rescued from the lion's mouth." Apparently, I think the Lord's mind was on Psalm 22 at the time of his death, which that's Jesus the Christ. But even so, Paul, as he approaches his death, he's got his mind on these things as well. And so we'll look at more of that when we get toward the end. But not only did the Lord rescue Paul at a time of his first defense, but Paul adds, "The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed," including this unjustly execution of what's going on here, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. So he's rescued from the lion's mouth. That's the physical rescue, as he is going to receive a temporary reprieve from execution. And then verse 18, the rescue is spiritual in nature. Even though his physical demise could no longer be avoided, even death would not separate Paul from God's love. When the executioner's sword severs his head from his body, his soul is going to be safe, and the Lord is going to bring him home to his heavenly kingdom, to heaven itself. Again, there was an unstated but I think implied lesson here for Timothy. If the Lord did not forsake Paul in his darkest hour, but stood by him and saw him safely through that ordeal, he would do the same thing for Timothy. Therefore, Timothy should not fear those who could kill the body, but not touch the soul. He wants Timothy to see things properly. Stop looking at things so physically, but think more spiritually and recognize that God is going to be with him. And contemplating the Lord's graciousness and the Lord's kindness, I think, moves him to that doxology. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. You know, I always think about Exodus 34, verse 6. Whenever I see these doxologies, that's that first one I come across I think is pretty significant, where it's speaking of God as being compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. That's who God is. And we see him extending that to Paul, and Paul's recognizing that. Most people would be looking at their situation as if I'm being abandoned, but Paul sees it as the Lord is there with me. Now, why would he think that? Was the Lord speaking to him at this moment? Did he feel the breath of God blow on him? No, I don't think that's it. I think it's that he did not abandon the truth. He preached the gospel. He received the opportunity to do that. And I think that was the Lord being with him and strengthening his heart. Now, it could have been like he did with when he was in the book of Acts in Corinth, and the Lord came to him in a dream and told him, do not fear, I have many people in this city. In other words, I'm going to be with you. Keep on keeping on for the Lord. Keep it up. And so Paul is trying to encourage Timothy. He's not trying to sugarcoat it. Bad things may happen to you, Timothy, but if they do, recognize the Lord is going to be with you like he is with me. Hang tough. Hang tough. Then we come to verses 19 to 22. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth, but Trophimus I left sick at Miletus. Make every effort to come before winter. Eubulus greets you, also Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. So here we have really the final remarks of Paul from his second letter. He's showing that he is a people person, right? I mean, there's a lot of individuals that had impacted Paul's life for good or even for bad. 17 individuals are named from verses 9 to 22. While there's many others that are included in the all there in verse 16, household in verse 19, brethren in verse 21, Timothy by those personal pronouns of your and you, and Paul named many individuals who were special to him. But he starts off with Prisca and Aquila. He wants them to be greeted, a technical term to convey a greeting to them as he closes this out. But it's interesting he uses that word Prisca. That is just a formal way of saying Priscilla. And she and Aquila, and Aquila, her husband, were longtime friends of Paul. He had stayed with them at Corinth when they were making tents together. They had traveled with him to Ephesus. When Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome, they were there. He's even said there in Romans 16, greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who for my life risked their own necks, to whom not only do I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles also greet the church that is in their house. But now, these two co-workers were evidently back in Ephesus, and Paul wanted Timothy to pass his greetings on to them. The wife, Prisca, is not always, but is listed first here, and that was an uncommon practice in that time. Of the 6 times we see these two named throughout the New Testament, she is listed first 4 of the 6 times. That's all. That makes me wonder, why is that? So I was curious what other people may have thought. Some of the suggestions out there was that Priscilla was of noble birth, while Aquila was noble born. I see no evidence for that. I don't know about that. Some say she was more outgoing personality than her husband, and that could very well be. One commentator said that the best explanation seems to be that she gained more prominence as their ministry continued. And if that was the case, she would neither have been the first nor the last woman to have reached that kind of prominence, to have been the most zealous one in her household. We see a lot of women in the New Testament who were far more zealous in their household than anyone else and were at a level of prominence. So maybe that's why she was listed first in Paul's letters. And Paul also sends greetings to the household of Onesiphorus. Earlier in the letter, he speaks of him as one who had refreshed him at Rome. He did that in chapter 1. But since Paul does not say Onesiphorus and his household, as is common when you make connections like that, some speculate, why is that? Is it because Onesiphorus is dead? Maybe he's out of town. He just wants the household mentioned. It's a little odd, but it could be that Onesiphorus had been killed. If he was still alive and active in the Lord's service, but maybe he's just not in Ephesus, but I think chances are he had been killed. But Paul recognized the sacrifices made by the family and of this faithful servant of God, and he wanted to express his appreciation for the man. Next, he identifies two other co-workers who had traveled with him, including journeying with him at during his first imprisonment to Rome. Erastus remained at Corinth, and Trophimus, he said he left sick in Miletus. Now, I think Paul's purpose was here to answer maybe some unasked questions of Timothy. We'll notice that even though we're not exactly sure who these men are, I think they have to be the men that traveled not only with Paul, but with Timothy. When we look at Erastus, Paul said he remained at Corinth. Now, again, that was a very common name. He could have been the Erastus referred to along with Timothy in Acts 19, which I think is more likely the case. But there's also the city treasurer of Corinth. But he's mentioning these guys just kind of out of the blue. They're not in Ephesus. They're not in Rome. They're in other places. I think he's letting Timothy know where his friends, his co-workers, are at. It's a kind gesture because he's writing to him. He's letting him know, here's where your co-workers, your buddies you travel with are. I left him in Corinth. Now, why? Some think that he wanted to go there in order to help out the Corinthian church. I have a hard time believing any young preacher would want to take on the work at Corinth. That's got to be a tough work. Remember, he sent tough Titus down there at first, or over there. And so I think more likely that Paul sent him to Corinth, or left him there to do the work and help out that congregation. So I think that's who this is. And so letting Timothy know where his friends at. Next, you got Trophimus. He's also named in Acts chapter 20 along with Timothy. He was of the province of Asia, we read about there. He's called the Ephesian. And he was he's the one that unintentionally caused the riot in Jerusalem that almost killed Paul, if you remember that from Acts chapter 21. But regarding the text here, Trophimus had become ill during those final travels as Paul was making his way going somewhere. And when they got to Miletus, I think he was probably going down to Jerusalem, but when he got to Miletus, he was so seriously ill, he had to leave him behind there. He couldn't continue the journey. Chances are he got left with some faithful Christian family, we're not sure, but that's a seaport city about 30 miles south of Ephesus. That's where Timothy's at. So it's probably news to Timothy that one of his friends is just down south. He was under the weather. But I think the fact that Paul left him sick instead of healing him is worth commenting. We've mentioned this before in other books, but here's another one. Even though some people think that the apostles could perform miracles whenever they wanted to, but if that was true, why didn't Paul just heal the man? Well, he couldn't do that. Miracles in the first century were not for the private benefit of those who could perform the miracles, or for the private benefit of believers. You know, Paul had that thorn in the flesh, whatever that might have been. Trophimus was left sick. Timothy had infirmities. We know of others who were sick that Paul could have healed, but he didn't. Because the purpose of the miracles was not to accommodate Christians, but to confirm the word. And once the word is confirmed for a person, it's forever confirmed, and they don't get any more miracles. It's not required. So you don't need this constant requiring of miraculous confirmation. So I think that's why he couldn't heal them. That was not the purpose of those miracles. And I just wanted to put that excursus out there on that. Verse 21, Paul repeats again that request for Timothy to come on down, make every effort to come before winter. So the same request he made over there, and from verse 9, and with that added qualification, before winter. And that's before winter because chances are he's going to want to get on a boat and sail his way over there, but if it's winter time, he's not going to be able to do that. He'll have to travel by land the whole way, and that will take a long time, and it's already a difficult road to travel, and it can be hazardous, and to do it in the wintertime makes it even worse. And so if he doesn't get up there, not only will Paul not have a chance to talk with Timothy, but he's not going to get his cloak before winter as well. Remember us talking about that. And so Paul wouldn't get that. But more to the point, if Timothy did not come before winter, he probably would not ever see Paul again. If he did not come soon, Paul would most certainly be executed before his arrival. And as Paul nears the end of the letter, he tacks on some more greetings. Eubulus greets you, Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. And these are generically here, for brothers and sisters, but you got these 4 listed names. They appear nowhere else in our New Testament, and 3 of them are Latin names. We don't know anything about them, but again, you pull out the commentaries, and there's, I would call, fanciful traditions about some of them, not worth noting, but I do want to note one that I always found to be interesting. There's a tradition that Linus listed here was the bishop of Rome. And maybe that doesn't mean much, but in certain realms that means he was the pope of the church at that time, because Peter had already been killed 2 years earlier. So now he is the second pope, according to that tradition. The problem with that is, if that was true, if Paul saw him as the pope, would he mention him so casually as he does? No way. Now, I do think he probably was a bishop in the sense as he was an elder in the church, probably in the Roman church, there in that congregation. But that is it. And all he does is list his name because the man sends his greetings to the church there and to Timothy and Ephesus. So we have these listings. Again, it lets us know that not all the Christians here have fled Rome from the persecution that Nero has been bringing down upon them. But it also prompts another question. Why did these not stand by Paul during Paul's first defense? If Linus was the pope, that's a man of note that could have done that. And that would be very cowardly if he did not do that. But chances are he was not a man of note. He was just a man, an elder in the church. And that was it. The Romans didn't know who he was. Maybe he couldn't do it. But even if he could, he didn't. Whatever the possibility might be, it no longer mattered to Paul. He had forgiven any slights given to him. But these individuals did want to be remembered to Timothy and the church in Ephesus. Maybe they were from Ephesus and they had friends down there. And that brings us to Paul's final salutation to Timothy. The Lord be with your spirit. Paul has prayed that Jesus would stand by Timothy even as he had stood by and strengthened Paul. And the use of the word spirit indicates how Timothy fared spiritually was far more important to Paul than how he fared physically in this realm. And there's also the implication that even if Timothy's body were destroyed, the Lord would be with his spirit and bring him home to his heavenly kingdom. And he wants Timothy to keep his eyes fixed there, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And then the second salutation, grace be with you. And grace is that word that, is part of Paul's theology. He begins and ends all his letters with grace. That grace from God the Father. And the you here, rather than earlier that was singular for Timothy, but here the you is in the plural. It's meant for the whole congregation of Ephesus. And before we really close things out, I want to look at 2 Timothy 4, verses 16 and 18 through 18, and Psalm, the 22nd Psalm, and see these similarities. Because I do really think, and it's only supposition, but I really think if I was in Paul's position, and I knew I was going to die, and if you knew you were going to, what kind of death do you want? Wouldn't that be the time when you would think, man, how did Jesus approach death? And you would start studying, and you would start diving into those things. And I'm sure the 22nd Psalm would be one of those things you would look at, because why have you forsaken me starts that chapter of verse 1. And so you see these similarities. Paul says in verse 16, no one supported me. 22nd Psalm, there is none to help. 2 Timothy 4, all deserted me. Why have you forsaken me? All the Gentiles might hear, there in verse 17. Psalm 22, all the ends of the earth will remember. Verse 17, I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. We mentioned that one. Save me from the lion's mouth. And then finally, in verse 18, his heavenly kingdom, and the kingdom is the Lord's. Paul's mind clearly, I think, is focused on those words. He's thinking about the things, he's trying to think about the things Jesus was thinking about as he approached his death. And that's what I see happening here. Now, the last question I want us to think about and consider for a moment, was Timothy able to reach Paul before winter? Did he get there? Was he able to pick up Mark and bring Mark along? Did he get the cloak? And did he pick up the books? And did those things arrive to Paul? I would like to think so. I would like to think he made it there. I can almost imagine the reunion of that, the joy, but there's not much time. Winter is approaching. Whether Timothy did or not deliver those requested items, that short time is coming. Tradition, the uninspired tradition, was that Paul was taken from prison and beheaded on the Ossian Way. And that ended the life of a man who had worked in the church for over 30 years, and it happened before winter came. However long it took Timothy, I like to think he made it up there. Paul had a faithful, labored life as an apostle and as a missionary. He was the life of one who, other than Christ himself, brought great change in the condition of mankind, with all the words he wrote down for us, with all that he did for the church in that short period of his life that he had left. And here now we say our goodbye to Paul. But we can look forward, you and I, we get to look forward to seeing him one day when we also depart from this life. We go to heaven, we'll get to see him and meet with this great apostle. But I want us to think about two more thoughts as we close things out. First, though Paul was gone, the Lord's work continued on. And that was Paul's main thrust, wasn't it? He wanted to make sure Timothy kept working. He made sure Titus went to Dalmatia. He made sure somebody was down there in Corinth. He was sending people everywhere. He wanted Mark, probably to send Mark somewhere, or maybe have Mark work in the Roman congregation there. He wanted to make sure the work continued after he was gone. God buries his workmen, right? But he carries on the work. And the second thing was that Paul was ready to die. He was ready to die. And we see that. It was clear. What about you and me? Are we ready to let go of this life? We often pray for folks, and I have no problem with this, so don't take this the wrong way, for the physical ailments and the physical issues that's going on in people's life. We do pray for those things. I think it's good we do that. But the greater concern, as we see from Paul, is the spiritual life. He's telling Timothy, come on up here. And he's praying for, he wants them to see how, Paul wants them to see how he's handling the situation. Because Timothy may very well find himself in the same situation Paul's in. And he needs to know and understand that those who are steadfast in staying in Christ, the Lord will stand beside them and strengthen them in the time of need. He needed to keep his eyes fixed on Christ and stop thinking so much about the physical problems of this life. Because if those were the biggest issues, Paul would have been able to heal Trophimus. He would have been able to take care of the problems of Timothy and all the others that he had come in contact with who had ailments, but he couldn't do anything about it. The purpose was to help people spiritually all the way to the very end. And when he approached death, he approached it, as we see, I think, from Psalm 22, just like Christ. That's the attitude I want to have. And I know that's the attitude you want to have. What a great letter from Paul, the final letter from a great man who did all he could for the cause of Christ. What a great man to follow, just like we follow Christ. Paul even said, follow me as I follow Christ. And we ought to be doing that. And he most certainly did to the very end. What will be said at the end of your life? What will your final words be? As one man said, talking about the words of Paul here, we get to see who the man really is at the very end. We'll get a glimpse at their heart from their final words when they know death is imminent. And when that time comes for us, what will our words be? It will show who we really are.